Hello there, my name is Nick Dale from Nick Dale Photography, and what I'd like to do now is to give you a brief introduction to Lightroom. So, the big question is, why should I use Lightroom as a photographer? And the answer is, as you can see from the before and after pictures of this tiger that I shot in Tadoba in India, it can make a big difference to your pictures. So it's an easy way to organise your pictures. It contains a huge array of built-in functions such as high dynamic range or HDR, focus stacking, and various others. Most professional photographers use it, so you're in good company. It works on a PC or a Mac, so it's not limited to one or the other. And Adobe also bundles Photoshop with Lightroom, and you only need to pay about £10 a month for it or so. So there are many good reasons to use Lightroom. How do I get started? Well, the first job is obviously to subscribe and to download Lightroom, and it might be a good idea to have a look online at some of the videos available. When I first started using Lightroom, I found a series of videos called An Introduction to Lightroom on YouTube by Anthony Morganti, and they were incredibly useful. So I think there are about 15 or so in the original series, but he also has a website and he releases updates every now and again as well. So it's well worth going through them initially, just to see step by step, module by module, what Lightroom is all about. And Anthony Morganti is very good at describing what you need to do, and obviously because it's a video, you can actually see what he's doing on his computer. And he even has a way of making the text and the icons look a little bit larger, so you can make it out quite easily. And if you want to, of course, you can simply reproduce everything he's doing using your own files. And that's a good way of getting familiar with all the different functionality. So, once you're ready to start using Lightroom for real, then your first job is to import photos to a particular directory or folder. So what I tend to do is I tend to use image capture. Now that's the default piece of software on the Mac for bringing in photos and image files. However, you can also use Windows Explorer, or you can actually use Lightroom itself. The only thing I would warn you against, though, is that if you use Lightroom, it tends to lose one or two images, so be careful. Admittedly, I tend to upload thousands of images from a game drive or something, but there was certainly one occasion when they just weren't uploaded where they should have been, and that panicked me into using image capture. So the advantage of using image capture is that you don't lose anything. It definitely passes from your camera memory card into your laptop or computer. However, then when it comes to importing them into Lightroom, all you need to do is to point Lightroom in the right direction. There's no copying involved, so you're not in danger of losing anything. So when you import, there's actually a dialog box that comes up and you can choose various options, there are various presets, but to begin with, you're better off just doing Command-Shift-E or Control-Shift-E on the PC and doing the basics. So either copy them across to Lightroom or just add them if you've already put them on your hard drive. Once they're there, then you can navigate around them using the library module. So it's all fairly straightforward. The key command that you need to know is G, which gets you back to the grid view of the library module. If you press return, it toggles between various different views, zooms in and then goes back to the grid view. But if you find yourself lost, you can't see the grid anymore, just press G and it'll be there. If you want to look at a particular image, then just press return, that's the easiest way, and then go back using G as usual. So when you're looking through your shots, it's probably a good idea to rate the best of them first. That's what I do. So a lot of people are very reluctant to delete anything or to reject anything. So the way around that is simply to focus on the ones you actually like. So what I do is I use the rating system that's built into Lightroom, and I rate the files that I think I can sell either 3, 4 or 5 stars. And you can do that quite simply in Lightroom, simply by pressing the number 3, 4 or 5. If you want to give them a colour rating, you can do that as well. So the numbers beyond 5 give you various colour options. So 6, 7, 8, 9, you get various colours. And it's even shown in the grid view, so you can see which ones you've chosen. If you want to select temporarily a few files, then you can always press a very strange key, which is the tilde key on the Mac keyboard, which toggles between these picks, if you like, and unpicking them. But it's useful if you just want to pick out a few files, work on them, and then get rid of the flags. So when you've isolated your favourite files, it's worthwhile just going through them again just to make sure you're convinced they're the best ones. One of the things I do just to make sure is to check the sharpness at 100%. So in Library View, you can click on the 1-to-1 button on the left-hand side, which allows you to see the files at 100%. So what that means is every pixel in the image is represented by a pixel on your screen, however big it is. So that's the kind of industry standard for checking for sharpness or noise or artifacts or blur or whatever it is. So once you're comfortable with your selections, then you can start to work on those files, the ones you've rated 3, 4 or 5 stars, or whatever system you've chosen. And the important thing, if you're going to use Lightroom to its greatest extent, is to add metadata. So the metadata is simply the information that the file carries in the form of text and numbers. So your rating, for instance, is an item of metadata. It's not part of the picture. There's not a big 4 plastered across your picture, but it's part of the metadata. So there can actually be an awful lot of metadata to your pictures. It's very easy to compress, so it doesn't take much space on your hard drive, but it does unfortunately take quite a while to add in the first place. So we obviously need a file name, which may or may not be the same as the title or the caption, and also it's very useful to add keywords because it allows you to find files that you need. And when you use keywords rather than a hierarchical folder structure, then it's much easier to find them because you can search for different things at the same time. Effectively, you're filtering using different keywords. So if, for example, I wanted to find all the pictures of lions that I'd taken in Africa, I can simply add the lion and Africa keywords, search on those, and I would find everything displayed in the library module. Now, the advantage of adding all that metadata is that functions like that, the search function, become very easy. So if somebody comes up to you when you're in front of your laptop and says, "Oh, can you show me all your elephant pictures?" You can do that in 5 seconds flat. If, as I say, you've added the metadata. If every single picture you have of an elephant has the tag metadata, the tag elephant in it, then you can easily find them. However, if you don't do that, yes, you save yourself some time, but you can't do simple tasks like find or search. However, one of the other benefits is that it allows you to upload your pictures to agencies. Generally, agencies have quite complicated rules for the format of the files and also for the metadata requirements. So, for example, a lot of agencies might specify that you have 7-word titles, or no fewer than 7 words, or captions that have no fewer than, or no more than 250 characters, or a list of keywords that was no more than 50 long, for example. Once you get familiar with the requirements of the different agencies, then you can come up with a default approach to tagging your files, and then it becomes a little bit easier. So with any file, once it's been given its metadata, titles, captions, keywords, and so on, then you might want to export it in order to upload it to the agencies. And generally, I've found the best size is 20 megabytes, and the best format is a JPEG, probably sRGB, but it doesn't really matter so much. Once you have those files, then it's just a question of tracking down the agency's FTP settings, and then you can use FileZilla or another similar program in order to upload all those files. Occasionally you'll find an agency that doesn't have an FTP server, so you might have to go to their website. So for instance, I upload via the web to Getty, I think IM, EYE, and Pixter, and 500px. But all the rest I use FileZilla for. Once you've uploaded all the files to the agencies, then you just have to keep track of the progress, if you like. So with most agencies you upload them, but then they're reviewed, and then you have to submit them again. So sometimes you submit them before they're reviewed, sometimes you have to add the metadata after they've been reviewed. Either way, it's a multi-phase process. So it's worth having a spreadsheet or something to keep track of all these files, so you know which agencies you've submitted them to and what stage they've reached. So you might have a flag which is, let's say, U for uploaded, an S for submitted, and a Y for accepted, something like that. And then you can keep track of how many of your pictures have been accepted by each agency, and ultimately how many have sold. I keep track of each picture, and I make sure that I know how many times it's been downloaded, and then on a separate spreadsheet I maintain a record of all the sales, obviously for tax purposes, but just out of interest. Initially, when you start selling images using agencies, it's quite exciting because the growth is so high. Obviously it's infinite. The very first month goes from 0 to 10 or 15 or 50 or whatever it is, which is great. And the next month probably 100, 150. So the initial growth is great, and it gives you a little bit of an ego boost, which is nice. And then afterwards it just plateaus a little bit, but still you should manage good growth for a few years. Once you've done all your uploading, then it's probably a good idea to back up to an external hard drive or to the cloud. I used to use a service called CrashPlan, and that was quite good. Initially it takes a few weeks to synchronize the computer with the cloud database, but after that it's very simple to find files. So if you do delete a file by accident, or if you want to roll back to a previous version, then all you need to do is to open up CrashPlan, search for the file name, and then you'll be presented with all the different versions. Not just the most recent one, but every single version that you need. So you can roll back a day, a week, a month. There are various options. And I have to say, when I first started using CrashPlan, I was very lucky because literally a week or two after I'd signed up, I accidentally deleted my finance and admin spreadsheets, which were crucial to running my life essentially. And luckily I was able to restore them using CrashPlan, so I was very grateful. Once you've backed up everything that you need backing up, then it's the time to be brave and delete all your unrated images. So these are the ones that you didn't think were worth keeping. I know it takes a bit of courage, but you don't want to end up with thousands of unwanted images on your hard drive, so it's worth biting the bullet. So this guide is intended as a very broad but quite shallow introduction to Lightroom. So I won't get into all the details of what's available in terms of the functionality and how you do everything. I think it's much better to use a video guide for that, but I can give you the broad outlines. So when you open up Lightroom, you will come across the main menu at the very top of your screen, which shows you a few different library and develop and other modules. The two that are really useful are the library module for viewing your images and doing basic developing, and also the develop module where you do most of your editing or post-processing. So to start off with the library module, these are the basic parts of the menus. So there are lots of menus. There are menus at the top, at the bottom, at the left, on the right. There are lots of them. If you feel a little bit overwhelmed, then you can always hit Shift-Tab, and that toggles between showing the menus and hiding them. So it just is easier to see everything. So what have we got? On the left-hand side, we have the navigator window, which is basically a thumbnail of the image that you've selected in the main view. And along the top, you've also got filters. So these filters are incredibly powerful for locating images. You can locate images using a text string, so keywords or titles or anything really. You can also use metadata, which is not just the obvious, but it's also things like whether the aspect ratio is portrait or landscape, whether it's taken with one camera or another, or one lens or another. Very, very powerful. So if you're trying to find images on your computer, it's much easier to do that in Lightroom than it is using Finder or Windows Explorer. So that's obviously one of the benefits of putting in the metadata in the first place. You don't necessarily have to do it all in one go, because if you have thousands of images, it just takes a while. But ultimately, that should be your goal. So going back to the left-hand side, beneath the navigator window is the area where you'll see all your catalogues and folders and collections. So folders are simply the folders that you have on your hard disk, but collections are collections that you create based on the images in your folders, and catalogues are also Lightroom creations, if you like. So they have different functionality, but one of the useful ones in terms of the collections is what's called a smart collection. So if you create a smart collection, you can set various rules or filters that allow you to keep track of all the images that fulfill certain criteria. So for instance, in my copy of Lightroom, I have various smart collections that keep track of all my 5-star images, for instance. And that means that whenever I want to work on my favorite images, I can immediately go to that smart collection, and I know that the image I see is the master image. It's not going to be one of the JPEGs that I might create. It's going to be the raw file if I have it. And I can then simply export my changes to a different folder if I want to. Along the bottom of the screen in the library module is the toolbar and the film strip, one above the other. The toolbar generally gives you more information about the image that you've selected, and the film strip is simply a different way of selecting and viewing all your images. So if you want to select an image from your film strip, you can simply scroll along from left to right and then click on one of the images and it'll pop up. On the right hand side, we have the quick develop area, which is simply a way of producing small but repeated changes on your files. So if you want to make a slight change, like increasing the exposure by a stop or a third of a stop or something, then you can do that very easily. And you can also apply that change to a number of different files at the same time. Now, it also gives you the option of applying a preset. So a preset is one of the great joys of Lightroom because it allows you to bundle together a whole bunch of edits and apply them in one go, either to one image or to a whole number of images that you've selected. So to create a preset, you will do that in the develop module, which I'll come on to later. But in the quick develop module, you will have access to those presets if you need them. Also on the right-hand side is the list of metadata. So there are different views for the metadata. In most images these days from DSLRs, you have EXIF data, which is the basic data of how the shot was taken, such as the shutter speed, the aperture, the ISO, and so on. But you also have IPTC data, which could be the country where it was taken, your copyright data, all kinds of other things. So you can select the view that you want to see. The default view, as it's called, has the basics and it's generally enough, but it doesn't include the headline field. So sometimes when we're creating an export for agencies, we need to have that headline field filled in. So at that point you have to switch to the IPTC selection, and that way you can put it in. It also includes keywords, and Lightroom is quite clever with keywords because you can have a Lightroom hierarchy of keywords. What that means is you can basically drill down from, let's say, animal at the top level to mammal to tiger, for instance. And all those keywords are already there in Lightroom. So if, for example, you want to do it like this, then you can simply add a keyword such as tiger, and then you can select one of the options, which is to add all the containing keywords. In other words, you can add all the keywords up the chain. So if I add tiger, I can end up adding to my exported file all the words at all the different levels above that. So mammal, animal, whatever else you've set up. So the advantage of the Lightroom hierarchy is that you can do tricks like that. But to be honest, I like everything to be very clear and very obvious. So I like to use what's called a flat system. So I simply list the keywords individually. Now, that doesn't really cost me that much because I've set up presets for all my keywords. So for example, every time I have a cheetah shot, I simply copy and paste all the cheetah keywords onto the image. So it's dead easy. But there are pros and cons to each approach. Finally, on the right-hand side, there's a comment section, but to be honest, I've never even used that. So you might want to use that for temporary notes or something along those lines, but I personally have never used it. It's up to you. Now, when it comes to editing your images, okay, so what else is in the develop module? There are various panels on the right-hand side which you can decide to have open or shut at any one time. There's a solo mode, in fact, that you can select by right-clicking on any of the panels, and that means that only one will be open at a time. But sometimes you want them all open because you're using them all, or sometimes you want them all closed, it's just too confusing. You can control that using the options. So split toning is the next panel on the right-hand side, and what that does is essentially it controls the color cast in the highlights and shadows. Now, a lot of people do this on black and white images. They effectively add color to them because it gives a kind of wacky look to them, which is quite unique and individual. But it's also possible to provide the same color casts on color images. In fact, there is a blockbuster look, as it's called, which is a kind of color treatment that's based on the equivalent of split toning. So if you're watching a blockbuster film, then you might find that they've used the teal and yellow color gradients. So teal and yellow, or yellow and cyan, they're complementary colors. So our eyes react to those colors, those pairs of colors, in a particular way. We see more color contrast with those colors. So blue and yellow, or that kind of thing. So when you have those complementary colors, you can actually create a good split toning effect by using those. So if you want to create the blockbuster effect, then you simply look up teal and orange, and you find out from Google what their value is in terms of the number of degrees. So it's the number of degrees on the color wheel. And once you know that, you can plug in that number to the split toning value, and that will give you the same kind of blockbuster look. But you can obviously do it with different colors as well. You can play around with it. And the balance obviously controls how much change, how much edit is applied to the highlights and how much to the shadows. Underneath split toning is the detail panel, and there is a thumbnail there, so you can see at a zoomed level exactly what you're doing to a particular part of the image. You can simply click on it or click and drag to get to the right bit. But beneath that you get various different options for controlling the sharpening and noise reduction, or luminance as they call it. So the first thing that you have to say about sharpening is that it's not really sharpening. I know it's called sharpening or sharpness, but actually once an image is soft or blurry, you can never make it sharp again. I know, it's very sad, but it's worthwhile emphasizing that, because what they're actually doing with sharpening is changing the contrast of the image. And that's a very different thing. It may look sharper from a distance, but you're not actually changing how sharp it is or how blurred it is. You're simply changing the contrast of different tonal areas. Now, imagine one of those old test cards where you had all the different shades from white to black. You might have 8 different bars on screen. So if we use that as an example, what the sharpening tool does is it looks for the boundary between 2 of those different bars, and it brightens the darker bar just before that boundary, and it also darkens the lighter bar just around that boundary. So that means that the contrast at the boundary itself is greater. Now, personally, to me, that's contrast. It's not sharpening. But I have to admit, if you use the sharpening tool and look at the image full screen, it does look sharper. But I think that's just a slack use of language. And obviously, Lightroom is trying to persuade us that we can actually turn something that's blurred into something that's sharp by calling it sharpening. But don't believe them. Okay, so sharpening is useful. Obviously, we want to make sure that the image looks sharp, whatever that may mean. But also, we have a problem sometimes with noise, or grain as it's called, with digital images. And the way we solve that is by changing the value of the luminance slider. So luminance can mean simply brightness. So in the hue, saturation and luminance panel, that's what luminance means. It simply means how bright is the colour. However, here, and confusingly, it has a different meaning. It means the degree of blur. So a higher value of luminance means a higher degree of softness or blur. So the reason why that might be a good thing as opposed to a bad thing is if you get these little artifacts or noise or grain. Typically it happens either when you have a very high ISO or possibly when you've edited a document an awful lot. So if you do lots of things to a file, you inevitably start to degrade the image quality. So one thing you can do is to bump up the luminance a little bit so that areas that might look a bit noisy look a bit smoother. But the danger of changing the luminance is that you might lose detail. So it's good to use luminance in those areas of the image where it tends to be quite smooth and homogeneous, but it's bad to up the image luminance globally because that inevitably impacts on areas that you want to be sharp. So you want this tiger's face to be sharp, for instance, so if you change the luminance value globally, then it won't be as sharp where it matters. So again, the solution is to do that adjustment locally. So you can use a local brush which has a noise slider, and you can simply push that to the right if you want to do it that way. However, if you do have a very noisy image where there's noise everywhere, then you can do it globally using the luminance sliders. There are different kinds of luminance though, so you need to know the difference. So there's regular luminance, if you like, or regular noise, and that doesn't have a color cast. So it's simply how blotchy the image is, if you like. So it's effectively the grain. And you can change that using the top slider. But there's also another kind of noise, which is color noise. So you change that using the lower slider. Color noise is when individual pixels don't work properly and they suddenly change color. So you might find in a green background, you might unaccountably have some purple pixels or some orange pixels or something bizarre that doesn't belong there. So what you have to do is to zoom in to 100% or look at the thumbnail view and then simply move the color slider to the right, and then you'll pretty quickly see that color noise disappear. So try and move it as little as possible. Don't just slam it over to the right because you'll again degrade the image quality. And equally with the luminance slider at the top, you don't want to push it all the way to the right because inevitably you will lose detail. You can fiddle about with the other settings, detail setting and so on, but it's best just to put it on maybe 25 or at most maybe about 40 if it's really noisy. More than that, it'll just be too soft, it won't be any good. Finally, on this page, we have lens corrections, and those are quite useful global settings which depend on the lens you've used. So the first one, enable chromatic aberration. You can basically correct for color casts in the image that are caused by the particular lens that you've used. So no lens is perfect, they all have slight imperfections, but these imperfections have been catalogued, so Lightroom knows what they have to do in order to fix them. And if you check that box, it'll happen automatically. It may be only very slight. If you check it and uncheck it, you might see something going on. It's not terribly very clear, but it's worth doing anyway. And then the checkbox underneath that will automatically change the image based on the profile that Lightroom has for the lens that was used. So occasionally it can't find it, but generally if you click on that tick box for a particular image, then you'll be able to correct images such as the pincushion effect, which is where the rectangle is squeezed or pulled at the corners, if you like. A bit like a trampoline. If you pull a trampoline at all four corners, the four corners move out, but then the sides come in. And that's what happens to some images sometimes with certain lenses. So profile correction you can do automatically, but you can also do it on a manual basis if it doesn't work. and you can fiddle around with the sliders to make it look as you wish. So this is the third slide on the develop module. What else have we got? We've got transform, we've got effects, and we've got calibration. So these are the last three panels in that right-hand menu. What do they do? So transform is very useful, particularly for architectural shots, because when we take pictures, we generally have to point up at buildings, and that changes the perspective. So if you know anything about perspective, then you'll know that there'll always be a vanishing point. There's a vanishing point at the sides of the image, there's a vanishing point at the top, and there's a vanishing point at the bottom of the image. So if you have vertical lines, they won't actually be vertical. They will tend towards the vanishing point. But in our pictures of buildings, we generally don't want that, unless it's a particular effect that we've decided on. So if you open up the transform panel, you will see various options for solving that problem. So the auto button will do a pretty good job most of the time, but then if you have a particular kind of image that has a lot of verticals, you can press the vertical button and you can play around with the options. There are lots of different ones. The effects panel is useful mostly for the vignette control. Now I know I said that you shouldn't do global adjustments, that you should do them locally, but the vignette controls do offer you quite good control over vignetting. So what is a vignette? It's basically the slight darkening or lightening in the corners of the image. Now initially in the early days of photography that happened quite naturally. The process wasn't perfect, the cameras and lenses weren't perfect, so you ended up with this darkening. But some people like it, and it also fulfills a function. So when you have a slightly darker set of corners to your image, it tends to focus the reader's eyes on the subject. So that's a good thing. So if you want to create that effect, then you have to change the post-crop vignetting slider to a negative value. Negative means it's darker in the corners, positive means it's lighter in the corners. If you want to go for a sepia look, then you can change the colours, and you can also go for a positive vignette. I think that looks better on old style retro look photos. But generally we want a negative vignette, which means the corners are darker. So that's one way of doing a vignette. You can also use a radial filter, which gives you more control, and it can feather a little bit more, so it's less obvious, but you can play around with that. The final panel on the right hand side is calibration. Generally, there are only a couple of things you need to look at here. Calibration is essentially the job of making sure the colours look the way they should look. So that's something you shouldn't really have to bother with. It's to do with calibrating monitors and things like that. It's very complicated and scientific. If you're a perfectionist, then you might want to change these settings. Different sensors might have slightly different colour casts, but to me, the only two things that matter are the process version and the blue primary saturation. So the version is the version of the developed engine, if you like, that Lightroom is using, and you just want to make sure it's the most up to date. So it might be version 2, 3, 4, 5, and it'll usually say current after the most recent one. So just make sure it's on current, and that means the functionality is available, it's doing the best job at reducing noise or increasing sharpness or whatever else the engine does behind the scenes. The second thing that's important is the blue primary saturation slider. Now, it's a little bit of a trick, but a lot of photographers end up pushing that slider to 25 or 50 or 75 or even 100 in order to give a bit of pop to the image. Photographers often use this word pop. What does it really mean? Well, it's a bit vague, but it just means it adds something. Try pushing it to the right and see what happens. It generally tends to increase the warmth of the image, but in a controlled way. So if you push it even all the way to the right, it doesn't get completely over the top. So play around with it, see if you can find a position that works for each picture. So, how do I edit my picture? What commands do I need to know? So again, this is only a quick and dirty version of all the options, but the most important are the ones shown here. And I've tried to show the Windows version and the Mac OS version, just in case you're on a different system. So importing, first of all, that's pretty easy, Control-Shift-I, and then Command-Shift-I on the Mac. If you want to open any photo in the Develop module, it's the same, D for both. Switching to grid view is the same, G for both. The loop view is when you stay in the library module, but you select only one picture to be full screen. So you can stay in the library module and press E and then G to get back to grid view, and then E again. The advantage of pressing E is that you get access to the metadata on the right-hand side. So you can change the title or the keywords for a particular image. If you crop an image, again it's the same, so R in Windows and on the Mac, and zoom is also the same, it's Z. You can set different zoom ratios on the left-hand side at the top, so it could be 1:1, or it could be fit, or it could be fill. Fit fits the entire image to the available screen size. Fill means it fills it up, which means you may be missing one side or the other of a landscape image, or one side or the other of a vertical image. When you're rating your slides, it's very easy. All you need to do is to press the relevant number. So 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, we'll rate them 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 stars, and you'll see that on the toolbar at the bottom of the screen if you press T for toolbar. If you want to remove your rating, you simply press 0. If you want to use the spot removal brush, which is very useful for center spots, or if you want to remove a piece of dust or piece of grass flying around in the air at an unfortunate spot in the image, then you can simply press Q. And then finally, when you've finished your edits, you can export your files using Control-Shift-E or Command-Shift-E. Generally, it's Control on Windows and Command on the Mac. So the reason why exporting your images is important is because, as I mentioned earlier, Lightroom is non-destructive. So what that means is that however many changes you think you've made to the file, if you then go into Finder or Windows Explorer and open up the raw file, you won't see the effect. But don't worry, you haven't lost those changes. They're simply written as what's called an XMP file or a sidecar file in Lightroom, or as part of the metadata. So every time you open up that file, Lightroom will simply go through the motions, making all those edits all over again to present the image as you want to see it in its most updated form. So as a result, if you want a permanent version of that image, then you have to export it probably as a JPEG or as a TIFF file. So a JPEG is the typical export format. It is compressed, so you can choose whatever size you like. You can choose the maximum size amongst many of the options that you're presented when you export. There are all kinds of different options, including metadata and sharpening, all kinds of things. But basically you want to set the file size, which should probably be 20 megabytes, and you want to make sure that the file naming is according to your system. So there are lots of clever presets in the file naming dialog box, so you can simply select whichever one you want. What I tend to do is make sure that I put the final name of the image in the title, and I actually export using the title rather than the file name of the raw file, because sometimes I make virtual copies. That's basically a copy of the raw file that I want to create a different image out of. So I might want to make it a much darker image or a much brighter image, or play around with something else. If you export using the title, then you never have to worry about having the same file name, because the titles of the master and the virtual copy will always be different. Now, you can always have a look at the keyboard shortcuts on your screen. So this is a screenshot of what you're presented, and there are lots of them, obviously. So these are things that you will learn over time, but I wouldn't suggest that you should learn them off by heart. You'll simply learn the ones that end up being important to you. So if you do a lot of cropping, you'll get to know R, because that opens up the cropping tool, for example. Now, what else does Lightroom do? I asked that question because we've obviously focused on the two main modules, the library and the develop module. And what you end up getting also is the map, the book, the slideshow, the print, and the web modules. So in broad terms, the map allows you to plot the location where you took your photographs. Sometimes this will happen automatically when you have a camera that has GPS, but you can also allocate a location using a map program. The book module obviously gives you the chance to create a photographic book. The slideshow allows you to create custom slideshows with music. If you simply want to create a slideshow, by the way, all you need to do is to select the images that you want and press Command and then Enter, and that'll run through them all. But there are also many options that you can select. You can create custom slideshows with particular intervals, or with a voiceover, or with music. The world's your oyster. The print module creates collages or other types of print layout, such as greeting cards or calendars. Sometimes Lightroom is a little bit short of options when it comes to creating calendars, for instance, but you can always find those online, and you can import them into Lightroom if that's easier. And then finally, the web module allows you to publish content to the web. I haven't used that, to be honest, but sometimes you might want to synchronize a folder on your laptop with a folder on Facebook, for instance, and that's also possible. So there you go. That's my introduction to Lightroom. I hope it's been useful. Enjoy the show, and good luck.